I still remember the sound that woke me up that Tuesday morning because it wasn't thunder and it wasn't one of my tractors coughing to life before sunrise. It was the deep metal growl of a machine that had no business sitting on my property. And when I pulled the kitchen curtain aside with a cup of coffee still warming my hand, I saw a yellow excavator parked sideways across my only farm gate like somebody had decided overnight that 32 years of my life no longer mattered. Most people probably would have stormed outside yelling before their coffee even cooled down, maybe called the sheriff or started recording a video for the internet. But I just stood there looking at it, took one slow sip, and quietly said to myself, well now, somebody's about to learn the expensive difference between owning land and understanding it. My name is Daniel Mercer, and if you drove through Ashford County, Kentucky, you'd never notice my place unless you slowed down long enough to see the old cedar fence leaning toward the road and the red barn my father and I rebuilt after a tornado back in the 90s. It isn't fancy land, never has been, but 70 acres can feed a family if you're willing to work while everybody else sleeps, and that's exactly what I had done since my wife passed away 8 years earlier. The gravel road leading from the county highway to my gate was nothing more than packed stone and dust, yet every bale of hay, every load of feed, every veterinarian truck, every memory of my children growing up had traveled over that stretch of ground. Around here we say a farm without access is just a museum with cows, and I believe that with all my heart. Things started changing the previous fall when a company called Blue Ridge Development bought the neighboring tract that had belonged to the Harper family for generations. Old Mr. Harper had always joked that deer outnumbered people on his land, but after he died, his grandchildren sold everything to developers from the city who arrived wearing polished boots that had never touched mud and sunglasses that cost more than my first pickup truck. The man running the project introduced himself at the local diner one afternoon while I was eating biscuits and gravy. He reached across the table with a smile so polished it looked rehearsed and said, "I'm Victor Langley. We're bringing growth to this county." I shook his hand and answered, "That's nice. Just don't bring it through my pasture." He laughed like I told a harmless joke, but something in his eyes stayed perfectly still. A week later, survey flags started appearing near the edge of my road. I pulled one out and leaned it against a fence post, figuring maybe somebody made a mistake. The next day, there were 5 more. Then I noticed men with measuring equipment standing exactly where my gravel lane crossed into what they now owned. One of them waved politely and shouted, "Just routine work, sir." Around here, when someone says routine work, it usually means you're about to discover a problem nobody mentioned. Sure enough, 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a neatly printed offer promising me $12,000 if I agreed to surrender permanent access rights so the company could redesign the entrance to their luxury subdivision. $12,000 sounded like a decent amount until you realized they were asking me to trade the only legal entrance to my farm for it. I read the letter twice, folded it, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it inside the top drawer of my desk. My neighbor Earl stopped by that evening to borrow a chain, and after hearing the story, he whistled low and said, "Danny, they're expecting you to blink." I smiled and answered, "I've been farming through droughts and bank crashes. I learned a long time ago that blinking at the wrong moment can cost you a whole season." Earl chuckled, but looked worried. "City money doesn't like hearing no." "Good," I replied. "Then it'll have to get used to it." Weeks passed without another word, and I almost convinced myself the whole thing had died. Then one morning, I noticed dump trucks rolling into the neighboring field before daylight. By lunchtime, bulldozers were clearing brush, and temporary fencing appeared along property lines that had stayed untouched for decades. Every afternoon, more equipment arrived, and every evening, I walked my fence with my old border collie Maggie, trying to understand why nobody from the company had contacted me again. Silence can be comforting in the country, but sometimes silence is just confidence wearing camouflage. The answer arrived before sunrise on that Tuesday when the excavator blocked my gate completely. Its bucket rested on the ground like the fist of a giant, and orange cones surrounded it as though the inconvenience belonged to me instead of them. 2 workers stood nearby drinking coffee while another leaned against a pickup checking his phone. One looked toward my house and shrugged. "He'll come out eventually," he said loud enough for me to hear through the open window, The other laughed. Probably sign the papers today. Nobody fights projects this size. I almost walked outside right then. Almost let pride take over, but instead I looked past them toward the gravel road, disappearing into the morning fog. And suddenly I remembered something my father used to tell me whenever neighbors argued over fences. He'd say, "Son, angry men make speeches. Patient men make history." So I set my coffee cup down, walked past the back door without opening it, headed into the hallway, unlocked an old metal filing cabinet that hadn't moved since Bill Clinton was president, and pulled out a thick brown folder covered in dust. Across the front, written in my father's handwriting with faded black marker, were 4 simple words that would soon turn one block farm gate into the biggest mistake Victor Langley had ever made. I carried that old folder back to the kitchen table and brushed the dust off with my sleeve, smiling to myself because my father had a habit of saving papers that everyone else thought were worthless. My mother used to tease him that if the house ever caught fire, he'd rescue the filing cabinet before he rescued the television. And he'd laugh and say, "The TV tells stories, these papers protect them." At the time, I thought it was just another one of his country sayings, but sitting there while a 30-ton excavator blocked my gate, those words suddenly sounded smarter than anything I'd heard from a lawyer on television. I opened the folder carefully, flipping past faded tax receipts, handwritten boundary notes, photographs from when we first laid gravel on the lane, and finally I reached the original deed from 1994, folded neatly with a yellow sticky note in my father's handwriting that simply read, "Never lose this." The language wasn't exciting, certainly not the kind of thing anyone reads for entertainment, but halfway down the second page my eyes stopped on a paragraph I hadn't looked at in years. It described an appurtenant easement guaranteeing permanent access through that exact corridor connecting the farm to the county road. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up because certainty has a strange way of calming a person. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't hoping. I knew. I picked up the phone and called the only attorney in the county who still remembered my father, a quiet woman named Linda Carver who handled land disputes the way old mechanics fix engines, slowly and without unnecessary drama. She answered on the second ring, and before I finished explaining, she interrupted me. "Danny, don't argue with anybody. Don't move the machine. Don't threaten anyone. Bring every document you have." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from her while she adjusted her glasses and read the deed twice without saying a word. Then she leaned back and asked, "How long have you been using that road?" "Every single season since I bought the place." "Before that?" "My father used it when he leased the pasture." She nodded again. "Anyone ever stop you?" "Never." She smiled for the first time that morning. "Well, Mr. Langley just built himself a very expensive problem." I asked if we should call the sheriff. She shook her head. "The sheriff handles arguments. The courthouse handles mistakes." She photocopied every document, called the county recorder's office, requested archive plats, and by noon we had confirmation that the easement had been recorded decades earlier and had never been extinguished. While she worked, I glanced out her office window and noticed construction trucks rolling toward the neighboring property as if nothing in the world could stop them. Confidence can be useful, but unchecked confidence becomes blindness. That afternoon, Earl called me. "You gonna do something?" I answered, "Already am." He lowered his voice. "They're telling folks at the hardware store that your road runs through their entrance, and it'll all be settled by the weekend." I laughed. "Well, maybe it'll be settled by the weekend. Just not the way they're expecting." Meanwhile, Victor Langley was giving interviews to local investors, talking about bringing families, increasing property values, creating opportunity, and if you only listened to him, you'd think he was building a small paradise instead of forcing a farm into a corner. One of his project managers even knocked on my door that evening, carrying another envelope. He stood on my porch, smiling politely. "Mr. Mercer," Mr. Langley asked me to deliver an updated offer. $20,000, and we'll install a new gravel driveway somewhere else on your property. I looked at him and asked, "Somewhere else where?" He unfolded a map and pointed toward a creek bed that flooded almost every spring. "Right here." I couldn't help laughing. "Son, have you ever driven through 6 inches of mud pulling 12,000 pounds of hay?" He shifted awkwardly. "I'm just delivering the proposal." "Then deliver this back to Mr. Langley. Tell him my driveway isn't for sale, and neither is my memory." His smile disappeared. Projects like this don't stop for one farmer. I answered quietly, "We'll see." The next morning, the excavator was still sitting across my gate. My feed supplier arrived with a truck and had to back down the county road after realizing he couldn't enter. He climbed out and scratched his head. "What's going on?" I shrugged. "Apparently progress." He laughed harder than I expected. "Looks more like arrogance." Before leaving, he added something that stayed with me. "Big companies always think small people don't keep paperwork." By Thursday, Linda filed the easement action together with a request for emergency relief, attaching decades of records, aerial photographs, maintenance receipts, witness statements from neighboring landowners, and copies of county filings that nobody on the developer's legal team seemed to have noticed. The hearing wasn't dramatic. There were no television cameras, no shouting, no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors. It was almost boring, which is exactly how real legal victories usually happen. The judge flipped through the documents while Victor's attorney argued that the subdivision represented economic growth for the county and that temporary inconvenience to one landowner should not delay a multi-million-dollar investment. Linda stood up calmly and replied, "Your Honor, this case is not about inconvenience. It is about an established legal property right that cannot simply disappear because someone with deeper pockets finds it inconvenient." The courtroom fell silent. The judge asked one question. "Counsel, was this recorded easement disclosed during your client's due diligence?" Victor's attorney hesitated for only a second, but sometimes a single second says everything. "We are still investigating that issue." The judge closed the file. "Then perhaps your client should have investigated before parking heavy equipment across another citizen's only access road." I didn't celebrate because judges rarely show emotion, but even I could hear the warning hidden inside those words. By Monday morning, the temporary restraining order had been signed, and the first person to call me wasn't Linda or Earl. It was a young man who introduced himself as an employee of the construction lender. He politely asked whether access litigation remained unresolved. I answered truthfully, "Yes, sir, it does." He thanked me and hung up after less than a minute. Later that afternoon, Earl drove into my yard, jumped out of his truck, and yelled before even shutting the door, "Danny, they're shutting everything down." We stood at the fence together, watching workers gather around in small groups instead of climbing into machines. One bulldozer shut off, then another. Pickup trucks that had been racing around the site all week suddenly sat still. Victor himself arrived wearing a hard hat and talking angrily into his phone, pointing first toward my road and then toward stacks of construction material. Even from a distance, I could tell he wasn't giving orders anymore. He was explaining failures. Earl leaned over and whispered, "Think he's calling lawyers?" "Yansuerad, no. I think he's calling bankers." By evening, rumors spread across town faster than weather reports. Someone at the diner claimed financing required groundbreaking before a contractual deadline. Someone else heard investors were demanding answers. The cashier at the feed store looked at me and grinned. Funny how one gravel road can hold up $6 million. I smiled, but didn't say much because I had learned something over the years. When the truth is working for you, there's no need to improve it with speeches. The next sunrise, I poured another cup of coffee and looked out my kitchen window at the same gate where this mess had begun, except this time the excavator's engine was running, not because they planned to continue construction, but because they were preparing to move it. And as its tracks slowly rolled away from my entrance, I realized the machine had never actually been blocking my future at all. It had been blocking theirs, and the real consequences for Victor Langley were only beginning to unfold. I stood there until the excavator disappeared around the bend, leaving behind nothing but fresh track marks pressed into the gravel my father and I had spread by hand all those years ago. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt the silence return to the farm. The birds came back before the workers did. The cattle wandered toward the fence like they couldn't understand why humans always manage to complicate perfectly simple pieces of land, and Maggie trotted through the open gate as if she were inspecting the victory herself. Earl pulled into my driveway an hour later, carrying 2 coffees and a grin that looked too big for his face. He climbed out, handed me a cup, and said, "You know, they're saying the lender froze everything." I shrugged. That's what happens when paperwork catches up with confidence. He laughed. Town's calling you the man who stopped $6 million with a filing cabinet. I looked toward the road and answered, no, my father stopped it 30 years ago. I just remembered where he put the papers. Over the next several days, the construction site transformed into the strangest kind of ghost town. Stacks of lumber sat untouched. Survey flags leaned over in the wind. Temporary fencing rattled every time a pickup drove past. The same men who had walked around carrying clipboards with the swagger of people who believed every acre already belonged to them now spent their mornings loading equipment back onto trailers. One afternoon, Victor Langley finally drove onto my property alone. No attorneys, no project managers, no polished speech prepared for investors. He stepped out of his truck, looked around for a moment, and then walked toward the porch where I was repairing an old gate hinge. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "I'd like to talk." I kept working for another few seconds before setting the wrench down. "You're talking." He took a deep breath. "This situation has become more complicated than either side expected." I smiled. "Not my side." He ignored that and continued. "There may have been mistakes during the title review." "May have been." I asked. "Your machine was parked across my gate for 4 days." He rubbed the back of his neck. "We're willing to discuss a mutually beneficial solution." I looked at him and remembered that first meeting in the diner when he laughed after I told him not to bring his progress through my pasture. The laugh was gone now. "Mr. Langley," I said, "you offered me money because you thought I'd sell my access. Then you blocked my road because you thought I'd panic. Neither one worked, so now you're talking about mutual benefit. That's a fast education." For a second, I thought he might lose his temper, but instead he stared down at the gravel beneath his boots. "Business moves quickly." I nodded. "Land doesn't." He left a few minutes later without another argument. We never shook hands. Weeks turned into months, and eventually the company redesigned its entrance using a completely different route that cost them far more than respecting the existing easement would have in the first place. Around town, people kept asking how much money I won, and they always seemed disappointed when I told them that wasn't the point. The biggest victory wasn't a check. It was driving my hay truck down the same road on the first cutting of summer, watching dust rise behind the tires exactly the way it had when my father sat beside me years ago. Some victories don't make headlines because they look ordinary to everyone else. A gate opens. A truck passes. A farmer gets home before dark. But ordinary things become priceless the moment someone tries to take them away. Every now and then, someone new moves into the county and hears the story secondhand. They usually ask whether I'd do it all over again, knowing how stressful it became. My answer never changes. I'd rather spend months defending one honest road than spend a lifetime wondering why I let someone erase it. There's another lesson hidden inside this whole experience that has nothing to do with easements or developers. People often assume strength belongs to whoever has the bigger machine, the larger budget, or the louder lawyer. In my experience, real strength belongs to the person who knows exactly what they're standing on and refuses to move simply because someone else expects them to. My father used to tell me that land remembers every pair of boots that walks across it. I think he was right. Long after the meetings ended and the equipment disappeared, that old gravel lane still remembers the mornings we hauled hay, the afternoons my kids rode bicycles, and the week a giant excavator sat there believing it could rewrite history. It couldn't. History was already written. It was sitting inside an old filing cabinet waiting for someone patient enough to open it. And that's why I still smile every time I drive through that gate, because I know the road isn't there by luck. It's there because somebody cared enough to protect it before I ever needed it. Now I'd like to ask you something. If you were in my position and someone blocked the only road to your home or your livelihood, would you have confronted them face to face, called the authorities immediately, accepted the money and walked away, or done exactly what I did and let the law speak for you? Tell me honestly in the comments, because there are people who still believe progress justifies taking what belongs to someone else, while others believe property rights should never be compromised no matter the price. I want to hear where you stand, and if this story made you think about justice, fairness, and the value of standing your ground, share it with someone else and join the conversation, because sometimes the biggest battles are fought without throwing a single punch.